Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for attending the session. This session is really going to be focused on team decision making and areas where bias can kind of come into this process. And we're going to do some participation at the beginning. We're going to do some small groups, some other kinds of things. So hopefully you'll be open to kind of trying some different things here in Zoom. So let me share my screen, and then also I should let you know that when I share my screen, generally I cannot see anybody. And so it's really hard for me to monitor the chat or to do things like that. So please, if you have questions during the presentation, or at any time, please just unmute your microphone and just kind of speak up. That's really going to be important. So my name is Yoji Shimizu. I'm a mentor in Minnesota First. I'm also on the First Upper Midwest Board of Directors, and I'm a volunteer doing a lot of work as Master of Ceremonies for various events in the Upper Midwest, as well as at Championship. And my day job is that I'm a professor and an associate dean at the University of Minnesota. And I do a lot of work in that space with students and with issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is really the question that we're going to kind of focus on, or kind of help you kind of think about, is really kind of how does your team kind of go about making decisions? And you're constantly making decisions. Some of those decisions are really important ones, maybe other ones maybe not so important, relatively speaking. But in all of those cases, we really want you to kind of think about the process by which you do that. So to start off, I'm going to basically take you through an exercise that will require a little bit of participation on your part. And in order to make this work on Zoom, I need you at least to unmute your mic. And if you're willing, turn on your camera. Okay, and leave your mic unmuted, because I'm going to be listening to vocal cues from all of you. All right, so please unmute your mic. And what I'm going to do is basically take you through a series of slides, and all you have to do in response to each of those slides is either raise your left hand and say left, or raise your right hand and say right. Okay. So you're going to see some categories come up on the screen. And in this case, it's going to be on your left, you'll see male, and on your right, you'll see female. And then you're going to see a series of words come up. And the word that comes up, if you feel that word is associated with male, you would raise your left hand and say left. And if it's associated with female, you'll raise your right hand and say right. Okay, that makes sense? Fairly straightforward. And we're going to do this with three, just as a test, we're going to do it with 3 robotics associated words. All right. And the key here is really not to think about it. Just as soon as you kind of make this association, say left or right. Okay. Got it? All right. Here we go. All right. First one.
Because when I was doing,
can I hear you?
Right.
Left, left,
Right.
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 Okay. Next.
doesn't do it.
Right. Right.
Right.
Next.
Left.
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 Great. Good.
How to be on the same.
That's exactly what we need to do. All right. So these were examples of three robotics teams, 2 all-girls teams, and 1 all-boys teams. Okay. We're going to do this again with a series of words. And again, if you associate the word with male, say left. If you associate the word with female, say right. All right. Ready? Okay. Here we go.
Left.
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 Right.
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 Okay. Good. All right. Fairly straightforward. Good job. All right. Now we're going to do this again. And we're going to switch things up a little bit. Now we're going to put liberal arts on the left, science on the right. And again, if the word pops up and you associate it with liberal arts, say left. If you associate it with science, say right. All right. And again, you want to kind of just as soon as you see it, make the association. Okay, you ready? Here we go.
Right.
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 Left.
Left. Right.
Right.
Left.
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 Right.
Right.
Right. Left.
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 Left. Right.
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 Okay, good. All right. Okay, now we're going to make it a little bit trickier. We're going to basically kind of essentially cross the categories. All right. So we're going to have female or liberal arts on the left, male or science on the right. Again, you're going to see a series of words come up. And again, if you associate it with female or liberal arts, say left, male or science, say right. Okay, you ready?
Left.
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 Left. Left.
Left. Right.
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 Left.
Right. Left.
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 Right.
Left.
Right.
Right.
Right. Right.
Right.
Right.
Okay, good. All right, one more time through, and now we're going to cross the categories again. Okay, so now it's male or liberal arts on the left, female or science on the right. Okay, so again, if it's male or liberal arts, you associate the word male or liberal arts, say left, female or science, say right. Okay, here we go.
Left. Right.
Left.
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 Right.
Right.
Left.
Right. Left.
Oh.
Right.
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 Right. Right.
Left.
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 Left. Right.
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 Okay, good. All right. So we just went through very quickly. I want to just, I got to get my screen here. Okay, I'm good with this. We just went through an exercise that's known as an implicit association test. All right, so and there's an online version of this that essentially many people, thousands, maybe millions of people have actually taken this test. And at least for this test, when you're associating male or female with liberal arts or science, for about 70% of the people who take the test, it's easier to associate female and liberal arts and male and science. And you may have observed that on your own. It took a little longer perhaps for you with that last set where you had male and liberal arts together and female and science together for you to say left or right. That's typically, about 70% of the people who take the test. That's the most difficult to do. A little easier for about 10% of the people to associate male and liberal arts and female and science, and about no difference for about 20%, right? If you're interested in kind of learning more about this and kind of maybe taking other tests, if you go to this website, this is actually where the implicit association test was developed. And there are actually lots of different kinds of associations that you can test yourself on. Whether it's, we did gender and science this morning, but you can do Native American, age, gender, career, race, religion, all kinds of different things in which you can do this. And what these tests are really trying to do is basically to reveal sort of our implicit or unconscious biases that we have obtained basically from the culture that we live in and the world that we live in, right? So when we talk about implicit or unconscious bias, we're really talking about really thoughts and feelings that are outside of our own conscious control. So, and it's sort of in this iceberg analogy, sort of all this other stuff that's kind of below the surface that we are unconsciously aware of. And this, what's important or what's useful about implicit or unconscious bias is it's a natural part of detecting patterns and making quick decisions. We rely on these kinds of unconscious biases in order to make those kinds of quick decisions, which is what the test is trying to get you to do, to kind of make those patterns and associations really quickly. So they can be helpful in many situations because they can help guide your intuition and your thinking, but they can also cause exclusion if we're not aware of them, right? So the culture really kind of shapes our biases and beliefs about people based on their age, their gender, their race, language, disability, income level, many times when we're not even realizing that that's happening, right? And there are a lot of examples of this that are relevant to robotics and relevant to STEM in particular, right? So here's one example of sort of, and I'm going to talk about a couple of these kinds of examples of unconscious bias that particularly affect women. So let's listen to this interview from Taylor Swift.
You're always going to have people going, did she write all her own songs? Talking about your personal life, talking about your dating life. There's a different vocabulary for men and women in the music industry, right?
Give me an example.
Okay, a man does something, it's strategic. A woman does the same thing, it's calculated. A man is allowed to react, a woman can only overreact.
All right, so that's one example. Here's another one. Anybody know what this image is?
A black hole.
Yeah, so this is actually the first image of a black hole, the major technical and scientific achievement of the last couple of years. And here is a post on Facebook from a woman who was involved in this project. So this is Dr. Katie Bellman. She's now an assistant professor at the California Institute of Technology. She played a really important role in the team that was involved. And so this is kind of her amazement. I just love the kind of look of joy on her face as she's kind of realizing this vision and dream is coming true that she's been working so hard at. So there was a lot of publicity about this achievement, and particularly Dr. Bauman's role in this project. And this is one example of one of the kinds of social media posts that were celebrating this achievement. And I want you to kind of read this really quickly and then think about where are some of the unconscious or implicit biases about women coming out in this particular post. And I should say that this particular post was really put together by an organization that you probably wouldn't necessarily have expected to have posted something that had what I feel are kind of a large number of biases that are here. So anybody want to chime in? Anything here looks kind of like if this were a man, would it have been written in this way?
They did not refer to her as doctor.
Yeah, so that's one. She's never referred to as a doctor or as someone who has a PhD, right? Any others?
She decided on the spot that she wanted to, in high school, she didn't spend like years at college. No, in high school, she decided she's going to make a photo of black holes, and that's what she did.
Okay, all right. Yeah, there was actually another post after this that kind of tried to correct this. And so one is this issue about honorifics and sort of the way in which she is being referred to. It's always Katie Bauman, not Dr. Bauman. Young lady. I don't think typically if this were a man that they would say this young man. So that's another one. She's an assistant professor at a faculty member at a major research university. And also this issue about single-handedly and the teamwork and sort of the project lead and all those other kinds of things, right? So these are all kinds of examples of where someone is writing something that's really celebratory and thought to be very complimentary, but some of these biases kind of reveal themselves in the language that's being used. So this is a pattern that's actually seen and has been documented in many, many cases when it comes to women. Women are interrupted more frequently in meetings than men. And you may heard of terms like mansplaining or things like that that exist. In higher education, women faculty members are less likely to be called professor by their students, whether male or female, than male faculty members are. Women in seminar programs, this is in medical school with physicians. If it's a female speaker, that female speaker is introduced by men at these conferences, much less likely by their professional title, like Professor so-and-so, and more by their first name, for example, than if it were a man that was being introduced in that kind of conference or professional setting. These are some examples of that. Now, these are other examples that have really significant impacts on success for women in the workforce and in their careers. This is a study that was published in 2012, and I really relate to this study because it involved faculty members like myself and like me. They took a resume for someone who was applying for a research position job in a laboratory, a research laboratory, a biomedical research laboratory, and they sent it out to 127 faculty members at academic institutions. The only difference between the resumes was that for half of those resumes, it was John, and for the other half, identical resume, it was Jennifer. And when these faculty members were asked to evaluate these resumes, basically what they found is both male and female faculty rated John as more competent and hireable than Jennifer. They offered a higher starting salary to John, and they offered more career mentoring to John. So again, this is an example of sort of this kind of cultural or unconscious bias that kind of exists. We don't even know we're doing it when we're kind of evaluating things like these resumes. This is another example. This is an editorial from about 4 years ago in the Star Tribune about a woman and a husband who were counseling and advising their daughter who was looking for a job. And their daughter turned out to have a name that was not maybe a non-traditional or not a typical name that might be encountered here in Minnesota. And they sent out all these, she sent out all these applications, and she didn't get any interviews. And so she turned to her parents and wanted to know what she should do. And they decided to do essentially a social experiment. They decided to change her first name on her resume and sent those applications out. So they changed the name to Kristen as her first name. And then she got 3 interviews and she got a job offer just by making that simple change, right? So again, the name creates some of these biases and responses that people aren't aware of. Another example of this is in emails. There are studies that show that if an email comes from someone who's named Jamal, for example, rather than someone named Brendan, that email gets fewer responses. Or if it's a telephone call from someone with that name, you get fewer callbacks. Right? So those are examples of some of the kind of barriers that kind of exist. And there are attempts by a number of organizations to kind of address this and try and figure out how can we minimize these kinds of biases. And I'll tell you 3 examples, and then we're going to kind of break up into some small groups. So this is the example from US orchestras. So this is a limit, when you think about this, this is a limited resource. There are a small number of positions, lots of musicians who want to be in a major US orchestra. And it's been noted for many years that the percentage of women in top 5 US orchestras has been very, very low. It was as low as 5% in 1970. But they've made some progress in this. And over the past, over the next 20 to 30 years, the percentage of women that joined US orchestras or were selected to join US orchestras went from 5% to 25%. So the process by which musicians are selected to be in orchestras is an audition process, right? You come in, you play in front of a group that's a judging group, if you will, that will make a decision about whether you'll be invited to join the orchestra or not. And so the approach that was taken by US orchestras to try and address this problem was to go to what's called a blind audition, right? So it used to be in the past, you would walk in, the people who were judging you were there, you would play, and then you would leave. So they decided instead to make it blind. So they put up a curtain or a screen And so the people who were evaluating, the musician could not see the person that was playing. So they were just listening to the music. And so when that process was started, that's when we saw this increase and this change in the percentage of women who were joining US orchestras. And there was one really interesting wrinkle in this whole process initially, was usually these orchestras, auditions happen on stage. It's a wood floor typically. And initially, they were not sort of seeing this kind of change happening. And it turned out it was because a lot of women were wearing heels. And so when they were walking onto stage, people could, the judges could hear the heels. And so they already knew that, okay, that was probably a woman that's playing behind the screen versus a man. So that now, in fact, in these kinds of auditions, everybody takes off their shoes. And so they walk onto the stage barefoot behind the screen. So that's, one example. These are two other examples of kind of this blinding process that's been used to kind of address this issue of bias. So the Hubble Telescope is another limited resource, and people apparently have to apply to get time to use the telescope. So you apply, you send in a proposal, and then you either get approved or not. And so they noticed actually in this application process that it was a lower percentage of women were getting approval for telescope time compared to men relative to the number of applications that were coming in. So they also went to a double blind process where nobody knew who was reviewing the applications and nobody knew who was writing the applications. And when they did that, they found out that they resulted in more women receiving approval for telescope time. Another example is coding, computer coding. So acceptance of women's code in various situations. Again, they went to a kind of a gender blind submissions process, and that also resulted in a higher acceptance of women's code compared to when there wasn't this gender blind submissions process. Right, so these are kind of examples of how blinding, for example, is one potential mechanism by which you can try and minimize any issues of bias that might exist in decision making in particular. Right, so what I would like to do is kind of break you up into some 3 or 4 different small groups. And I would really like you to talk about, not so much, talk to each other about this particular decision that all of you need to make on an FRC team is like, how do you actually figure out who gets to drive the robot? Who gets to be on the drive team, right? What is the process by which you use to figure that out? And I know teams do lots of different kinds of things, and they're all really interesting. And then also, once you kind of go through that discussion, talk about, do you have any concerns about that process in terms of, do you feel it's equitable? Do you feel it's really giving you, identifying the very best people on your team that are capable of being the drive coach or the driver, the operator, so on and so forth, right? So I'm going to put this in the chat, and then I'm going to put you into, let's say, 4 small groups for about 10 minutes, let's say. And then we'll come back and have a quick small group discussion, okay? Let's do 8, right? And feel free, of course, to introduce yourself when you do that. Okay, so, okay, here we go. So you should be able to join. All right, everyone, welcome back. We have got about, let's say about 10 minutes, I think, to do some discussion. So I'd like to hear from each of the small groups, kind of tell us about what you discussed, any interesting approaches that are being taken or common approaches that are being taken to kind of make this important decision for your team about who's on the drive team. And maybe we'll start with room 1. And I had Caleb and Celeste and 4607 and Jane on that room. Anybody want to be brave and speak up and report out?
I can give a summary and then maybe some of the other people can comment as well. But in our group, we really narrowed it down to, I think, 3 main factors that we use for selecting drive teams. One is based on a rules test, making sure that drivers understand what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do, especially because of potential for penalties. The second one is a skills test, looking at how well the person is actually able to drive the robot. And the third item that's considered is gracious professionalism, because the drivers have to collaborate with other teams on their alliance for every match. We look at that as a pretty significant factor when selecting the drive team.
Great. Anybody else from that group want to chime in? Jane, it seems like the rules test and the skills test, there are probably some processes or criteria that you use or that teams use. What about that third piece, the gracious professionalism piece? How do you?
That one is more subjective, and that is evaluated by the mentors. As I said, it's a combination of those things. So if students do well if they express an interest and then they do well on both the rules test and the driver skill test, then that gracious professionalism is the factor that may decide whether they make the drive team or don't make the drive team.
Okay, good. All right, let's move on to room 2. Louisa, Phoebe, Shamit. Anybody want to report out? Don't be shy.
From our group, I think the consensus was that our teams kind of don't really like to select them. It's more like people volunteer, and then we just decide based on like a lot of factors, like the other group presented. We just look at all of those factors, and then as a group, we make a decision.
Shamit, how do you make that decision? Like, is there some piece of paper that has a list of criteria or evaluation that you kind of assess, or how is that done? And do you do it as a group or individually, or?
Yeah, it's usually done as a group. We usually just have kind of group discussion, just talking about the different aspects that the drivers will have to pertain to. And usually people who want to become driver usually just present why they think they can do all the roles effectively and with the least concern.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, group 3, Billy, Grace, Ian, Sahil, I hope I got that right. Anyone?
Yeah, so our group really just kind of talked about how to get to that leadership position and what it takes to get there. For example, I heard a lot of teams, they do some sort of as they were talking about in the first group, tests, knowledge tests. I love the idea of the gracious professionalism thing, although I could see a little bit of bias coming with that, but that's just my personal opinion. But it's a great idea. I like it. Our team does something similar. I think something new to bring to the conversation is like, how do you get into that a leadership position on your team? And how our team does it is we have each student who's interested, they must have 1 year of experience on the team, and they have to apply to a mentor, and the mentors ultimately make that decision on who becomes a leader. I don't know if there's anything else to add to that.
Mhm. Okay. Grace, is it that only those team members that apply to a mentor are considered for something like a drive team?
Yes, so we try to incorporate everybody to at least take the tests and do the knowledge-based things to
Mhm.
see, so that we're not excluding anyone from becoming a leader, becoming part of the drive team. If you're interested, you always have the opportunity, no matter what.
Yeah.
And I think
Okay.
that's the biggest part.
Good. Thank you. Anybody else from group 3? All right, group 4, Candace, Levi, Richard.
Our process is very similar to what Jane described, with a knowledge test and a skills test. Every student who's interested can take those exams online and then in person for the skills test. The other part that we do that's maybe a little different is, in addition to just the regular driving skills, is the driver will either go in another room or turn their back, and a mentor will disable something on the robot, and then see if, when they come back in the room, if they can find out what it is and repair it. Because repairs on the fly are pretty important for the drive team. So that's a new wrinkle that we've added to it. And then we take all those things into account. One of the mentors makes a big spreadsheet, and the mentors also take into account temperament. How well will this person do under pressure? Will they, and can the group get along? The dynamics of the groups that we're looking at. Because we have had issues, and I think most teams have, where the drive team will just have some people who just can't get along. And under pressure, it's really important that you're able to communicate with each other.
Mhm. Okay, great. Anybody else from that group? All right, where are there potential areas where bias could creep into this process? Or do you have any concerns about bias potentially influencing the decision-making process here?
I think easily, when we're talking about personalities, there can certainly be a bias of introvert, extrovert. Will that introvert really speak up when necessary? We have all girls, so that's one part of the equation we don't have to deal with. But I think that personality can play, people's perceptions of their personalities can have a big play in that decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? What about in the skills portion? I'm assuming when you talk about skills, you're talking about actually somebody, a team member kind of actually operating the robot and driving it through some obstacles or meeting certain time challenges or things like that, I'm assuming, or, any concerns there at all?
I mean, I think the skills portion is easily the most subjective portion of, besides if you're doing something like gracious professionalism or something like that, which is also, I mean, based on your own interactions with someone. I think that the skills portion can, every competition is different, every match is different, every opportunity is different. And so when we do a skills portion, it's really hard to quantify skill unless it, like, between two very close candidates. Like, it's easy to say this person crashed the robot, but it's also very hard to say, well, this person got 30 points and this person got 40 points. What was the cause of those 10 points? Because we're switching out people, we're moving people around. So I think it's hard to make that distinction.
Ian, how have you tried to kind of minimize any concerns about bias? Can you, or not?
I think just the more, as in any scenario, the more trials you have with one person, the more accurate of a result you're going to get. Because one event, one match, one time. So I know even on our team, we do multiple matches, we do different pairs, we do different combinations of people. Really, you're trying to maximize the likelihood that this is an accurate representation of who they are as a driver. And you do that by getting as many trials as possible. Same with any other experiment.
Okay, good. Does any team actually blind themselves to knowing who's driving the robot? Or which pairs of students are operating the robot?
We've done some where we just set up an obstacle course and time them, and that's fairly objective. It doesn't test, of course, all of the skills that you need in a match, but certainly does evaluate their skill in terms of maneuvering the robot like through an obstacle course.
Yeah, interesting. I have heard of one team that is actually doing the skills test in a blinded fashion. So whoever is evaluating that group of students, they don't know who's operating the robot at the time that that's being done. So all they're doing is watching the robot. That team has also gone so far as to actually pipe a lot of music into the room because they don't want to hear the students talking to each other while they're interacting with the robot, because then they know who's operating it. So so it's a very interesting approach. I only know of one team who's kind of gone to that level, but it's I think they've been trying to sort of figure out whether knowing who's got control of the robot may influence the way in which they're interpreting the dynamics of the interpersonal interactions, as well as sort of the way in which the robot is kind of moving and operating. It's kind of interesting, kind of the way that that's being done. And again, it's sort of an issue of kind of a little bit about inclusion as well as equity, right? It's sort of, I think in a lot of cases we have students who have been driving for a while, and so the question is if there's an issue of newer people who want that opportunity, our team's really providing the framework by which they can be given their best opportunity to kind of shine. Those are difficult decisions and really challenging. Yeah, Candace.
I'm wondering, have they noticed any impact and change after implementing those changes?
You know, I don't know how long they've been doing that. I don't know how long they've been doing it that way, to be honest with you. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. You know, the blinding is sort of just an interesting thing to kind of think about. I will say that I think even in the cases where it's been touted as being really effective, like for example with orchestras, even today there's still some discussion about how effective that approach actually works, particularly with regard to diversifying the people who are in orchestras. It seems to have done pretty well for women, but there's some concern about whether it's actually being effective, for example, in improving the racial and ethnic diversity of orchestras, which remains very, very low, right? And in the context of FRC, you know, we have 25% of our FRC participants are girls, are women. And I actually don't know whether that's representative of the makeup of drive teams in the FRC, in our FRC universe. Yeah, I'm not sure. So that's, you know, it's just interesting to kind of consider that. Like, are those opportunities being given? So we are at time. I want to just kind of leave you with a couple of just thoughts about this issue. So again, you know, this concept about your biases can often kind of reveal themselves if you think again about sort of some of the words, like how do you associate a team captain or a head mentor or a build team member or a safety captain, chairman's presenter, programmer, business lead, outreach lead, human player, robot driver, right? These are all really important roles that people play on an FRC team. And how do you think about those in terms of the way in which you're kind of evaluating students on the team who might be appropriate for each of those positions? And what role could any inherent unconscious bias kind of play into those decisions, right? So what can you actually do about this? You know, we've talked about this a lot. One is awareness, right? That we all have these biases, and it's just important, really, really important to be aware of that as you're kind of working through these kinds of decision-making processes. It's really important that when you see examples of where you feel bias is really unfairly impacting the process, that you call that out, either your own bias or other people's bias. One really important thing that we've learned is that it's really important to slow down. So when we're in a hurry, like when you do that test, that's when you kind of rely on these biases. That's when sort of your intuition kind of kicks in. And so when we're kind of in a hurry, we're anxious, we're stressed, that's when the bias issue can really reveal itself. So slowing down is important. And then the other important thing is like having a process. So going through, as many of you are doing, which is great, like a rules test, a skills test, maybe a gracious professionalism test, you know, just some approach, a clear approach that has criteria that allow you to sort of think carefully about the way in which you're making decisions. And being transparent about it to your team, I think, is also going to be very important. So that process and thinking carefully about it before you kind of go through these exercises is something that's really, really important and really critical. And then finally, a couple of other points. So, you know, a lot of this is related to, you know, comments that Dean made this morning and comments that were made in the chairman's chat about the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, you know, as Karthik kind of mentioned in the previous session, it's not just the right thing to do, it will make your team better if you provide these opportunities to everybody on your team. So, so another way in which you can kind of talk about the role of bias or the role of these kinds of things is have your team complete the first online diversity training. Both students and mentors, there are very good modules that exist on the FIRST website for both students and mentors to complete. Be very intentional about trying to recruit women students and mentors and students and mentors from diverse backgrounds to your team. Again, diverse teams clearly outperform homogeneous teams. And so the creativity is better, the innovation is better, the success is better, all the way around. And then once you're able to recruit those students and mentors, you need to be really intentional about creating space and opportunities for those individuals to be to play leadership roles in all of these different components of your team. Regardless of whether they want to be on the drive team or they want to be a programmer or they want to be a builder, you want to create those spaces and those opportunities for those students to find their spot in the team and be successful. And then finally, again, remember that, you know, this is a very important goal and objective of our program. And so even if you do not submit a chairman's award, it's good to kind of reflect on some of the questions that are being asked in the Chairman's Award new executive summary questions, such as describing your team's efforts in the past 3 years to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion within your team first and your communities. And again, these do not have to be necessarily really big kinds of projects. It can be as simple as the approach that you're taking to actually make sure that everyone has an opportunity to be to play a leadership role in this particular aspect of your team, and what are the processes and approaches that you've developed to make that happen, and how are you evaluating whether that's working or not. That can be a really great way to kind of demonstrate your commitment to sort of to equity and inclusion on your team. So those summary questions are really great prompts for every team to kind of be thinking about in terms of the way in which their team is operating and moving forward. Okay, any other last minute questions? Concerns? Okay, I apologize. I think we went 5 minutes over, but thank you everybody again for attending this morning and attending all of the JUMPSTART sessions. I hope that many of you will come back on November 14th to continue this